My name is Naomi Vega. I'm 29 years old, and if you had asked me a year ago whether a family can smile at you while quietly building a trap beneath your feet, I would have said yes too quickly, like someone answering from experience. I would not have needed time to think about it. I grew up in a house where love was measured in usefulness, where approval came dressed as advice, and where my younger brother Adrian was treated like a promise, while I was treated like a problem to be solved. The strange thing is, when you live inside that kind of family long enough, you stop noticing how twisted it is. You start calling it personality. You call it stress. You call it the way mom is. You tell yourself everyone has a difficult parent, everyone has a golden child sibling, everyone has one person in the family who gets praised for breathing while another has to earn the right to sit at the table. That's what I told myself for years. It was easier than admitting that I had spent most of my life trying to win warmth from people who only seemed to value me when I was quiet, useful, and willing to give up whatever they wanted. The only person who never made me feel like I had to audition for affection was my grandfather, Mateo Vega. He was the kind of man who made you lower your voice without asking, not because he was harsh, but because he carried a kind of calm authority that made chaos feel embarrassing. He had built a marine supply business from almost nothing, and even after retirement he still moved through the world like someone who believed discipline was a form of self-respect. He wore pressed shirts, polished shoes, and an old silver watch he wound by hand every morning. When I was little, I used to sit on a stool in his garage workshop and watch him repair things people thought were too broken to save. Lamps, cabinets, cracked picture frames, warped side tables. He would sand patiently, fit joints back together, replace what needed replacing, and never rush the process. People ruin good things by hurrying, he used to tell me. The truth shows up when you slow down. I didn't understand how much that sentence would matter until much later. By the time I was 29, I was running a small restoration studio out of a converted industrial space in Ballard. It wasn't glamorous, and according to my mother, it wasn't impressive either. She called it my little workshop, in the same tone other people used for a child's lemonade stand. Never mind that I had real clients, real invoices, and months where I barely sat down because there was so much work to do. Never mind that I had built it myself after years of freelancing, side jobs, and late-night panic over rent. In my mother Celeste's eyes, my career would always be a decorative side note compared to Adrian's polished job in branding and his talent for moving through expensive rooms like he belonged there. Adrian was 26, handsome without trying, charming without effort, and so used to being forgiven that he often didn't notice when he'd done something worth apologizing for. My mother adored him with a kind of proud, breathless intensity that would have been touching if it hadn't come at everyone else's expense. Especially mine. Then in early spring, everything shifted. My grandfather had a fall that winter. It wasn't catastrophic, but it scared all of us more than anyone admitted. He spent time in the hospital, then a few weeks recovering at home, and while my mother made polished phone calls and Adrian sent fruit baskets with handwritten notes from an assistant, I did what I had always done. I showed up. I drove him to follow-up appointments. I picked up prescriptions. I reorganized his kitchen so he wouldn't have to bend for heavy pans. I brought him groceries he actually liked instead of the bland, expensive things other people assumed elderly men should eat. None of it felt heroic. It felt normal. He was my grandfather. He had been there for me in 100 quiet ways when I was growing up. Being there for him was not a burden. It was the most natural thing in the world. One rainy Thursday afternoon, about 6 weeks after his fall, he called and asked me to come by his condo. His voice sounded steady, but formal in a way I recognized from childhood. Mateo only sounded like that when he had already made up his mind. I found him sitting near the window with a mug of black coffee and a folder on the table beside him. Outside, the sky over Elliott Bay was flat and silver, and the whole room smelled faintly like cedar and old books. He didn't waste time with small talk. He asked me to sit down, folded his hands, and said, "Naomi, I'm making some changes while I'm still clear enough to enjoy the consequences." That was his version of a joke, dry and sharp at the edges. I smiled automatically, but my stomach had already tightened. Then he told me he had revised parts of his estate plan. The waterfront loft in Pioneer Square, the one above the old converted cannery with exposed brick, tall windows, and a view of the harbor, was being left to me. Not shared, not put into a family trust. Left to me. I remember staring at him, honestly wondering if I had misheard. That loft was the kind of property people talked about in hushed, admiring voices. It wasn't just beautiful. It was valuable. The kind of place my mother would describe as appropriate for entertaining. The kind of place Adrian would instantly imagine himself living in, even if it didn't belong to him. My first reaction wasn't excitement. It was disbelief. Why me? I asked him, because it felt too direct to ask anything else. He looked at me for a moment over the rim of his glasses, and his expression softened in that quiet way only his ever did. Because you show up, he said. Because you ask how I am before you ask what I'm doing with my property. Because when people talk to me lately, I can hear them measuring me. You don't. I felt tears sting the back of my eyes, which annoyed me because I have always hated crying in front of people, even people I love. He noticed anyway. He always noticed. I'm not confused, Naomi, he added. I know exactly what I'm doing. I wanted to believe that would be the end of it. That legal paperwork, once properly signed, would simply become fact. That grown adults would accept his choice because it was his to make. But even sitting there in that warm, quiet condo, with rain threading down the windows and my grandfather speaking in the calm, measured tone of a man who had survived harder things than family disappointment, I felt a chill move through me. Not because of him. Because I knew my mother. I knew how quickly warmth could turn to strategy in her mind. I knew that once Celeste Vega heard the loft was going to me, she would not see it as a gift from father to granddaughter. She would see it as a theft from the future she had imagined for Adrian. And somewhere deep in my chest, before a single accusation had been spoken, before a single lunch invitation or manipulative phone call or public performance had begun, I knew this was not going to stay quiet. I knew that the moment my grandfather's decision became known, my family would stop pretending I was merely disappointing and start treating me like I was in the way. After that conversation with my grandfather, I drove home through the rain with both hands locked around the steering wheel and a strange pressure building behind my ribs. On paper, nothing terrible had happened. No one had yelled, no one had made demands, no one had accused me of anything. An old man had simply made a legal decision about his own property. But families like mine do not need an explosion to begin a war. Sometimes all it takes is one person quietly choosing the wrong favorite. For the first week, everything stayed eerily calm. My mother texted me twice to ask how Mateo was doing, which by itself was suspicious, because she rarely asked me for information unless she planned to use it somewhere else. Adrian sent me a photo of a new espresso machine he had bought for his apartment, followed by a message that said, "Grandpa doing okay?" As if concern were an afterthought he'd remembered to attach. I answered both of them politely. I told myself maybe I was imagining the danger. Maybe I had become so used to tension that I expected it even when it wasn't there. Then, 11 days after my grandfather told me about the loft, my mother invited me to lunch. Celeste never invited me to lunch without a reason. We met at a bright little restaurant on Lake Union where the water sparkled outside and every table looked curated for social media. She kissed my cheek when I arrived, complimented my coat, asked about the studio, and smiled so warmly that if I had not known her all my life, I might have mistaken it for affection. For 15 minutes she played the role of the thoughtful mother, reconnecting with her busy daughter. Then the conversation shifted with such practiced smoothness I almost admired it. She asked whether Mateo seemed clear these days. She asked whether he was sleeping. She asked whether he had mentioned making any big financial decisions while emotional. I set my fork down and looked at her. There it was. Not concern. Reconnaissance. I asked why she wanted to know. She gave a tiny laugh and said, "Oh, Naomi, don't be defensive. I'm just trying to make sure no one is taking advantage of him while he's vulnerable." The word vulnerable hung between us like smoke. Not confused. Not recovering. Vulnerable. A word carefully chosen because it could be repeated later to the right people in the right voice. I told her Mateo knew exactly what he was doing. Her smile thinned just slightly. I hope so, she said, because families can be damaged for years by impulsive choices. That was the beginning. After that lunch, I started noticing the changes almost immediately. A cousin who usually answered my messages within the hour suddenly took 3 days. My Aunt Lucia canceled coffee with me, claiming she had a lot going on. A family group chat I had muted but never left somehow disappeared from my phone, and when I checked, I realized I had been removed. No one told me. No one explained. That was always my mother's style. She preferred punishment that could be denied. If you called it out, you sounded dramatic. If you stayed quiet, it worked exactly as intended. Then came the rumors. I heard the first one from an old family friend who stopped by my studio with a chair she wanted refinished. While I was writing up her estimate, she cleared her throat and said, almost kindly, "I'm sure you didn't mean for things to look the way they do." I asked her what she meant. She looked embarrassed, which told me everything before she even answered. "People are saying you've become very influential with your grandfather lately." Influential. That was the polite version. By the end of the week, I learned the less polite versions, too. I had isolated him, I had pressured him, I had positioned myself, I had taken advantage of his recovery to steer him into changing things in my favor. None of it was true, and that almost made it worse, because lies spread fastest when they are designed to fit the shape of what people already want to believe. I kept going to the studio every morning and acting like my hands did not shake when I unlocked the door. Work helped. Restoration is all about patience. Sand a surface. Strip away old damage. Look closely. Do not rush the truth. I clung to that. But underneath the routines of my days, something colder had begun to form. I was no longer just being dismissed. I was being turned into a story. The greedy daughter. The manipulative granddaughter. The difficult woman who could not be trusted around money and grief. My mother understood something I didn't fully understand yet, which was that if she could control the story, she would never need to control the facts. She could let me keep the loft for the moment if she successfully poisoned everyone against my right to it. Then later, when the pressure became public, people would think they had always known something was off. What frightened me most was not even the gossip. It was what I began to see in Mateo. Over the next month, he seemed more watchful, less at ease. He would still make dry jokes, still ask about my clients, still criticize my coffee for being too weak, but every now and then a shadow passed over him so quickly I might have missed it if I hadn't known him so well. Once, while I was putting away groceries, I found him staring at a stack of unopened mail with a look I had never seen on his face before. Not confusion. Distrust. Another time, I mentioned that my mother had asked whether he was making emotional financial choices, and his whole body went still. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, very carefully, "If anyone asks you what I've signed, you tell them to speak to my attorney." That was not a normal response. That was the response of a man who had already discovered something rotten and was still deciding how much to reveal. I asked him directly if something had happened. He looked out the window toward the water for a long time before saying, "Some people mistake access for permission." I waited for more, but he only shook his head and asked me whether I had enough walnut stain for the cabinet I was restoring. By early fall, he moved out of his condo and into a private rehabilitation residence on Mercer Island. Officially, it was for peace, recovery, and convenience. Unofficially, I knew it was retreat. My mother told people he needed supervision. Adrian joked that Grandpa was becoming high maintenance. I said nothing, but I felt it then more clearly than ever. Something was wrong beneath the surface of all this, something bigger than family jealousy and social pressure. And still, I didn't know the full truth. I only knew that my mother was tightening the narrative around me, while my grandfather was quietly fortifying himself against something he had not yet named aloud. By the time Adrian's engagement party invitation arrived in its thick cream envelope, elegant and smug and impossible to misunderstand, I had already learned the new rules. I was being invited back into the family not because I was forgiven, and not because I was wanted, but because they were ready for the next stage. Whatever came next, they intended to do it in public. By the time Adrian's engagement party arrived, I had already spent weeks arguing with myself about whether I should go at all. Every instinct I had told me it was a trap. My mother had gone from freezing me out to suddenly calling me darling again. Adrian, who had barely spoken to me for months unless he needed something, sent me a message saying he hoped we could put family tension aside for one night. Even the invitation itself felt like performance. Thick cream paper, embossed lettering, a rooftop venue in downtown Seattle with a skyline view, and a private chef, all of it designed to signal elegance, success, and the kind of family image my mother had always worshipped. But I also knew what would happen if I didn't go. I would be called bitter, unstable, jealous, dramatic. My absence would become evidence against me, another convenient detail in the story they had been building. So I put on a dark green dress, fastened my grandfather's silver bracelet around my wrist, and drove into the city with that dull, familiar feeling of walking willingly into a room where I would be outnumbered. The rooftop was exactly the kind of place Celeste loved. Glass walls, polished concrete, low golden lighting, white flowers arranged in sculptural clusters, waiters moving silently with trays of champagne, the whole city spread beneath us like something expensive and conquered. Music drifted through the air, just loud enough to soften conversations, but not enough to hide them. I stood near the edge for a moment after I arrived, looking out at the lights over Elliott Bay and telling myself to stay calm, stay polite, stay impossible to blame. I should have known my mother had no intention of making that easy. She greeted me with an air kiss and a smile that never reached her eyes, her hand resting for just a second too long on my arm as if she were confirming I had, in fact, shown up for my own execution. Adrian was no better. He looked sleek and pleased with himself in a tailored navy suit, one arm around his fiancée Sienna, who was beautiful in that glossy, effortless way that made everyone else look slightly unfinished. He hugged me lightly, and then, before I had even finished saying congratulations, leaned in and asked, "Did you bring the paperwork?" For a second, I actually thought I had heard him wrong. "What paperwork?" I asked. He frowned like I was being deliberately dense. "For the loft," he said. "Mom said you understood that tonight would be the right time." And there it was. Not just entitlement, but certainty. They had talked about my property as if the decision had already been made, as if my role was not to choose, but to comply. I remember staring at him and realizing, with a clarity that almost felt like calm, that Adrian truly did not believe my no had any weight. In his mind, the loft was already moving toward him the way everything else in his life always had. He and Sienna had apparently even discussed plans for it. Renovations, furniture, entertaining. He said all this in a low, irritated voice, as though I were the one creating inconvenience by failing to cooperate with plans no one had ever had the decency to run by me. I told him, as evenly as I could, that there would be no paperwork and no gift. He looked stunned for a second, then offended, then almost embarrassed, like I had broken some social rule by speaking plainly. "You don't even need a place like that," he said. "You'd barely use it." That sentence stayed with me because it was so revealing. He did not mean I wouldn't appreciate it. He meant I would not perform it correctly. I would live there instead of using it as a symbol. I would make coffee there in sweatpants, bring work home, leave books on the counter, open the windows when it rained. To Adrian and my mother, that was almost a misuse of something beautiful. I stepped away from him before I said something I couldn't take back. I needed air, needed distance, needed one quiet corner of the rooftop where I could steady myself. That was when my phone rang. My grandfather. The moment I heard his voice, something in me tightened. He did not waste words. He asked what was happening, and I told him enough for him to understand. Then his tone changed. It sharpened. He told me that if my mother presented any documents to me that night, I was not to sign anything under any circumstances. I said I wouldn't. Then he said something that made the whole world seem to tilt slightly beneath my feet. He told me there was a sealed file with his attorney, Evelyn Hart. He told me that if Celeste pushed this in public, I was to call Evelyn immediately and ask for the file. I asked him what was in it, and there was a pause long enough to fill me with dread before he finally said, "Proof that your mother's greed did not begin with the loft." He did not explain further. Not then. He only said that he had hoped never to need it, that he had wanted to believe some lines would never be crossed by his own child, and that if she forced the issue tonight, he would not stay silent any longer. I hung up, feeling colder than the evening air should have made me. At 8 o'clock, my mother took the microphone. The room shifted around her immediately, because that was what people always did. She praised Adrian and Sienna. She spoke about love, legacy, and the joy of family gathering for meaningful milestones. Her voice was rich and polished, every word measured for maximum effect. Then she smiled out at the crowd and said, "Before we toast the happy couple, there's one more beautiful moment our family wants to share." I knew before she said my name. I knew from the way her eyes found me, from the tiny pause she used to build anticipation, from the hush that moved through the room when people sensed something ceremonial was coming. "Naomi," she said warmly, "come join us, darling." Every face turned toward me. I could feel the pressure of their expectation like a hand at the center of my back. When I reached the center of the rooftop, she handed me a thick folder and kept hold of the microphone. "As many of you know," she said, smiling at the guests, "family means supporting one another in real, tangible ways. Naomi has been in a position to do something extraordinary for her brother and his future wife, and tonight she's chosen to make that gesture official." Then she opened the folder just enough for me to see the tabs, the signatures required, the legal transfer documents prepared in advance. She had not invited me to a celebration. She had summoned me to a public shakedown. There was a ripple of approval from the crowd, the kind of soft applause people offer before they understand what they are applauding. My mother tilted her head slightly and whispered, without moving her smile, "Don't embarrass yourself." I don't know exactly what broke in me in that moment. Maybe nothing broke. Maybe something finally locked into place. I took one look at those papers, then lifted my eyes to the room full of strangers, investors, friends, relatives, all waiting for me to smile gratefully and disappear into the role assigned to me. "No," I said. Just that. One word. My mother's smile held for a fraction of a second too long. "Sweetheart," she said into the microphone, laughing lightly, "you're nervous. It's all right." I stepped back and spoke clearly enough for those nearest us to hear. "I'm not nervous. I'm not signing anything." The entire rooftop seemed to go still. Adrian looked furious. Sienna looked confused. My mother's eyes flashed, but when she spoke again, her voice dripped with pity. "I'm so sorry," she told the room. "Naomi has been having a difficult time lately. Grief affects people in strange ways. She's become a little paranoid." There it was. Not a slap, not a scream. Worse, a public attempt to erase my credibility before I could even defend myself. I looked straight at her and said, "What makes me paranoid is discovering that forged documents seem to run in this family." Then I set the folder down, turned my back on all of them, and walked out while the silence behind me cracked into gasps, whispers, and the first real signs that my mother's perfect evening was beginning to come apart. I made it all the way to the elevator before my hands started shaking. Not while I was standing under my mother's smile. Not while Adrian stared at me like I had just set fire to his future. Not even while a rooftop full of strangers absorbed the sentence I had dropped into the middle of their perfect celebration like a brick through glass. It was only when the elevator doors closed and I was finally alone that my body seemed to realize what had happened. My heart was slamming so hard I could feel it in my throat. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked pale and older than I had 30 seconds earlier. When the doors opened into the lobby, I walked straight past the front desk, out through the glass entrance, and into the cold Seattle night. It had started raining again, a fine mist that clung to my hair and bare shoulders, but I barely felt it. I stood beneath the awning, opened my phone, and called Evelyn Hart. The second she answered, I said the exact words my grandfather had given me. "I need the sealed file." There was no hesitation on her end, no confusion, no questions. Just a calm, immediate reply. "Understood. Stay where you are. He's coming." So I waited. I sat on a low concrete planter outside the building, with my dress soaking at the hem and my heels damp from the pavement, watching town cars slide up and away from the curb, while people inside the club continued pretending the evening had not just cracked open. My phone buzzed 3 times. "Adrian." then my mother, then Adrian again. I didn't answer any of them. A part of me knew that whatever words they had for me now would be designed to pull me back into the script they preferred, the one where I overreacted, misunderstood, ruined things, needed calming down. I was done being calmed down. 50 minutes later, a black sedan stopped in front of the entrance. Evelyn stepped out first, polished and composed as ever in a charcoal coat, a leather file case in one hand. Then my grandfather emerged from the back seat with his cane, slower than he used to be, but carrying himself with the kind of straight-backed control that made everyone around him seem flimsy by comparison. The moment he saw my face, his expression changed. Not shock, not confusion. Recognition. He reached up, touched my cheek lightly with one hand, and said, "She did it publicly, then?" I nodded. Something in his face went still and hard. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we'll answer publicly." We rode the elevator up together, and I remember thinking absurdly that I had spent my whole life going into rooms with my shoulders already half-curled inward, bracing for what my family might say about me. But standing beside Matteo and Evelyn in that elevator, I felt something different. Not safety exactly. More like alignment. Like for the first time, I was not walking into a room alone with the truth. When the doors opened onto the rooftop, the party was no longer a party. Clusters of guests stood in tight circles, talking in low, excited voices. The music had stopped. The waiters had vanished into the edges of the room. Adrian was arguing with Sienna near the bar, his face flushed and tight with panic. My mother stood near the center of the terrace, rigid as a marble figure, still beautiful, still immaculate, and so focused on controlling the scene that she didn't notice us immediately. When she did, the color drained from her face so fast it was almost unreal. "Dad," she said, and for the first time that night there was nothing polished in her voice. "You shouldn't be here." My grandfather didn't even slow down. "Apparently," he said, "that has not stopped anyone else from discussing my affairs in public." The rooftop fell silent around us, the way rooms do when people sense something irreversible is about to happen. My grandfather stopped at the center of the space and turned so everyone could hear him. He did not ask for a microphone. He didn't need one. There was something about his voice, even now, that made people listen because they understood instinctively that interrupting him would be a mistake. He introduced himself plainly, then said that the loft in Pioneer Square belonged to me, Naomi Vega, by his choice, through legal transfer, executed properly and intentionally. He said he was of sound mind when he made that decision, and remained of sound mind now. He said any statement suggesting otherwise was false. Evelyn opened the file case and produced copies of the transfer documents, the witness signatures, the attorney certifications, and a medical competency letter signed during the same period. Not because he had been required to prove anything, but because he had anticipated that someone might eventually try to rewrite reality. Then she drew out a second set of papers. I will never forget the look on my mother's face at that moment. It was not anger. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that strips away performance. Evelyn explained it carefully, almost clinically. 2 years earlier, a substantial line of credit had been fraudulently opened against one of my grandfather's Tacoma properties, using forged authorization documents and signatures that did not match his verified hand. A forensic document examiner had reviewed the records. Banking timelines had been checked. Submission trails had been traced. The authorization requests led back to channels connected to Celeste Vega. My mother tried to interrupt once, then again, but every attempt sounded thinner than the last. My grandfather cut through her denials with a calmness that was somehow more devastating than shouting. He reminded the room that on one of the dates in question, he had been recovering from surgery and physically unable to appear for the signing he was supposedly present for. He asked, quietly, if she wanted to explain that. She couldn't. Adrian stood frozen, staring at our mother as though he were seeing a stranger assemble herself out of pieces he should have recognized years ago. Sienna slowly stepped back from him. Her father, who had been all smiles earlier in the evening, moved to Evelyn's side and requested the name of the investigator in a tone so polite it sounded lethal. Around us, the whispers swelled and shifted. You could almost hear people reorganizing their loyalties in real time. Then my mother did what people like her do when the story slips out of their control. She tried to create a new one on the spot. She said I had poisoned Matteo against the family. She said grief and age had made him vulnerable. She said Evelyn had manipulated him. She said everyone was twisting innocent financial confusion into criminal intent. She said too much, too fast, with the desperation of someone who had spent a lifetime relying on confidence to win and could not comprehend why confidence was failing her now. My grandfather listened until she ran out of breath. Then he looked at her, not as a father looks at a daughter, but as a man looks at someone he has finally stopped excusing. The greatest mistake I made, he said, was confusing love with silence. The words landed harder than anything else that night, because everyone there understood, even if only dimly, that he was not just exposing a fraud. He was naming a pattern. Years of silence, years of protecting someone from consequences because admitting the truth would hurt too much. I felt something shift inside me when he said it, like an old lock finally turning. We left a few minutes later. There was nothing more I needed to hear, nothing more I needed to prove. As we stepped back into the elevator, I could hear voices rising behind us. Adrian calling after my grandfather, my mother demanding that no one leave, someone from the Cross family speaking in a clipped, furious tone. But the doors closed, and for once, their chaos did not follow me all the way down. A month later, Sienna ended the engagement. My mother's name surfaced quietly in inquiries and legal conversations that could no longer be smoothed over with charm. Adrian called me twice, and then asked to meet, but I wasn't ready. My grandfather, meanwhile, came to visit me every Sunday after I moved into the loft. The first evening I spent there alone, I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor with takeout containers beside me, watching the harbor lights ripple across the windows, and understood something I had never fully allowed myself to know before. Surviving a family is not the same thing as belonging to one. Sometimes belonging begins the moment you stop begging people to see your worth and start protecting it yourself. That loft was mine, my name was mine, my voice was mine, and for the first time in my life, I knew I was not standing at the edge of someone else's story anymore. I was finally living in my own. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the end of this story. If this journey touched you in any way, please leave a comment and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you won't miss the next story. Your support means more than you know. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again in the next story.